We at the Rappel are convinced that living together with people of different religious convictions requires a clear separation between politics and religion, between law and faith. In this task, we must fight against two tendencies. Some liberals tend to consider that the fight against religious claims in politics was and remains legitimate if these claims come from Catholic Church, but that Islamic claims must be treated differently, because Islam is the religion of the poor, who are already discriminated by xenophobia. On the other hand, some conservatives, with no intention to secularize the Belgian state, tend to consider that Belgium must defend her Christian tradition and that foreign religions must adapt. We refuse both inappropriate compassion and discrimination. Our point is clear. The law must be the same for all citizens. Religion can neither be a privilege nor a handicap. And the only way to reach this goal is to consider people equal citizens with equal rights and equal duties by promoting what unites, not what divides. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Julie, you've written on sex industry, both in Britain, inner city Britain, as well as international. Do you think religion generally is compatible with secularism? Are they contradictory? And what does that mean in the work that you've done? That's the question. I know you prepared a speech, but is that sort of something that your experience that you want to sort of?
Well, it's more that I think the police and unfortunately many men on the left will excuse crimes towards women and children if perpetrated, certainly within this country, by some men from the Muslim community. These crimes are not committed because these men are of Muslim origin. They're committed because they are men who know that they are likely to get away with it. But unfortunately what then happens is a cultural relativism that is just horrifically dangerous for women and children, in which white liberals and the police react to them will sooner protect horrendous abuse than run the risk of being called racist. And so many young people in my journalism and in my research that I found have been procured into sexual exploitative situations have been given a very, very raw deal when their abusers are Muslim origin. Now, the point is that when the racists and the BNP, as you all well know, ascribe a particular significance to men, for example, of Pakistani origin who run pimping gangs, they are wrong. They use the wrong significance. But it is significant when men are from particular ethnic and religious communities who work in gangs and who get away with violence towards women and children. But it's not the significance ascribed by the racists. And when I first wrote about the exploitation into prostitution of young white girls in Blackpool in 2004, I was immediately placed on Islamophobia watch. I did have friends who told me I should be proud, but it didn't particularly feel like it at the time. And they basically said this, that in me discussing, and I thought very carefully in the oh-so-liberal Guardian newspaper, about the poor police practice in their refusal to uncover what was essentially a sexually exploitative pimping gang towards white girls in Blackpool. When I suggested that this was highly significant, but not in the way the BNP said, of course, what Islamophobia Watch said about me was that I had fed vitriol to the BNP, I'd given them ammunition. Now what I would argue, and I argued then and I would argue now, is that the reluctance and the failure of white liberals to tackle these issues, and in fact to hold the hands of extremists, gives nothing but ammunition to the BNP, to fascists and racists. And I'm left wondering what's happened to feminism. What's happened to white Western feminists in that we're so terrified of the label of racist or Islamophobic that we sell our sisters down the river and collude with men who mean nothing but harm to women within their communities and cultures? And I include the Vatican, which I would describe as fundamentalist. The ideas and the practice that comes from the Vatican is entirely fundamentalist. I would include those from the Orthodox Jewish community in Stamford Hill who have routinely covered up child sexual abuse and who have routinely said it can be dealt with in the back rooms of the rabbi's home. And of course, I would include Islam, and I would include every single fundamentalist religion. What's different, as has already been pointed out very eloquently at this conference, about Islam, is that you have the male secular left supporting them over women. Now, one example of this is the media kerfuffle around the publication of the book, Does God Hate Women? I don't know if you remember this publication. Whatever you think of the book, and it's not perfect, it was a very interesting examination of religion and of misogyny. And this is what the liberal press said about it. They denounced the authors as inflammatory in the extreme. This was in the Independent newspaper. Authors who produce torrents of invective and show no desire to go beyond name-calling and distortion. The Guardian, paper which I write for, accused them of prudeness and lack of insight. It was staggered anyone wanted to publish them and concluded that only a base desire to make money could explain the release of a profoundly intellectually dishonest, hysterical and bizarre work. And this particular passage that I'll read you from the book, and I'd just like to know what is so inaccurate about it. Well, what can one say? Religious authorities and conservative clerics worship a wretchedly cruel, unjust, vindictive executioner of a god. They worship a god of 10-year-old boys, a god of playground bullies, a god of rapists, of gangs, of pimps. They worship, despite rhetoric about justice and compassion, a god who sides with the strong against the weak, a god who is a male and who gangs up with other males against women. They worship a thug. They worship a god who thinks little girls should be married to grown men. They worship a god who looks on in approval when a grown man rapes a child because he is married to her. They worship a god who thinks women should receive 80 lashes with a whip because their hair wasn't completely covered. They worship a god who is pleased when 3 brothers hack their sisters to death with axes because one of them married without their father's permission. And of course, if we think about what happens under Sharia law, we can see examples, but not only under Sharia law. Devout Catholics marry their 7- and 8-year-old girls in full wedding regalia to Christ, and my partner's niece was married age 16 to a man that she had never met on her own before, because she lives under Jewish Orthodox rule of her father. And this is someone who came from a liberal, secular family and who got bitten by the bug of religious fundamentalism. And so, I'd just like to ask why male left organisations and individuals, and of course patriarchal governments, work with religions without requiring them to demonstrate their commitments to women's human rights. Where is the international condemnation that we saw under apartheid? Where is the parallel? And if we actually look at the hypocrisy, nothing illustrates it more than left men and this particular issue than the vastly different treatment of Ayaan Hirsi Ali with someone like Tariq Ramadan. And Ramadan, who is supposedly seen as a moderate face of Islam, despite the fact that he's spoken out against equality of women, presumably because his critique of capitalism rings all the bells for the left. And we know that Hirsi Ali was berated, including by the Guardian newspaper, for her condemnation of fundamentalist religion, and yet he was lauded. We also saw this when Ken Livingstone invited Karidawi to City Hall and embraced him, despite the fact that Karidawi would like to see me, as a lesbian, feminist and a woman, punished very severely. Where is the Alliance for Feminism under this type of pandering to extremism. And I would argue very strongly, just to finish, that you cannot possibly have feminism and religion together. They are vastly incompatible. There are women who the government insist they have consulted from the so-called Muslim community when they develop their policies. In reality, they have not consulted women who were born into Muslim communities who are secular and feminist. And that means that by default, these women's voices are not heard. And I think it's up to white women, white feminists, to ally ourselves with our sisters under oppression and not to the men who wish to abuse and oppress them. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Annie, can I ask you to make a contribution now? Yes.
Well, I try to think about this round table. What's the meaning of this round table? Well, of course, there is a contradiction between fundamental principles of democracy and among which, of course, equality between men and women and the content of religion or their interpretation. Those who govern us have solved the problem, saying there is a separation between public affairs and religion. But it's not enough. It's not enough because you have the day-to-day life and you have the pressure on women. So secularism cannot be just that. And this is the point for me. Where is the litigious issue in this case? It is on what is private and what is not private. We all agree on the fact that public affairs and religion have to be separate, although we have shown this morning that there are a lot of influences. But at least they cannot make it directly, while in day-to-day life they can do it. This morning somebody said that it's Professor Grayling. How can we change the mind? We are all struggling on consequences. And what is important is the symbols. Let's take the example of the Islamic veil. We all know what means the Islamic veil. It means a political and religious sign. It means segregation between men and women. It means that the body of women is source of disorder in public space. All of this is contrary to our democratic and equality values. And we say, okay, but it is in public space. We can do nothing about that. Of course, in France, they are a little bit special. They have the laïcité à la française. So here we have a litigious issue. What are we doing? I am an activist. I am not a philosopher. I am an activist feminist. My background was scientist. If I am involved in feminist, is to make our status progress. So I want symbolic actions, as Mandela has done in the past,